A question from Group 2. What major economic changes occurred in the Philippines throughout the 19th century? The major economic change occurred in the Philippines throughout the 19th century was a growth demand for sugar, abaca, and rice, which mainly profited the friars and hacienderos. The demands for these products were being exported.
To answer the question for Group 2, what were the main factors that gave rise to Filipino nationalism in the 19th century? Many causes contributed to the emergence of the Filipino nationalism in the 19th century, including achieving and gaining for the sense of loyalty that Filipinos share, based on common language, history, culture, and desire for independence. Because of the desire to recover our lost independence, Spanish abuses or dictatorship, agricultural concerns or the loss of Filipino lands, and the religious intolerance of the Spanish authorities, Filipinos stands up. The opening of Philippines to international or global trade, the development of the middle class, and the infusion of liberal ideas from Europe and the opening of the Suez Canal were all factors that contributed to the formation of the Filipino nationalism in the Philippines.
A question from Group 3. What kind of machineries and consumer goods were brought here to the Philippines by Western countries that made the country of the Filipinos prosper economically? Consumer goods would mean raw materials from the Western countries. That meant that, for instance, Chinese silks were commodities used for exchange. The kind of machine was mainly agricultural machines. The threshing machine, or also known as a thresher, is an agricultural machine used by farmers to separate grains, stalks, and leaves by beating the plant. It is not actually the machines that made the Philippines prosper, but it helped the hard-working Filipinos work faster than the traditional manpower.
For Group 3 question, in Spain, how did conservatives that wanted to keep the royal family in charge of the government change their ways to what the illiberals wanted, which democracy? To answer that, due to political instability in Spain, the Canovate system or rotativism was implemented, in which liberals and conservatives in Spain took turns controlling the country's affairs. The Canovate system of the 19th century saw liberals and conservatives take controls of the country's affairs. The liberal concept included freedom of press, equality before the law, freedom of speech and assembly, and freedom from arbitrary detention. Despite growing anticipation, it became obvious that conservative officials and priests would hinder and prolong effort at liberal reform. Liberals wanted representative governance as opposed to the conservatives' authoritarian monarchy and equality before the law as opposed to legally distinct classes.
Group 4. What is Rizal's major contribution to the Philippines' independence in the 19th century? With humility, Rizal fought for independence through his writings that stimulated the movement for independence. Actually, aside from the Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo that exposed the corruption in the Philippines and eventually led to his execution by the Spanish colonizers, he also wrote the poem A la Juventud Filipina, or To the Filipino Youth, which is a repercussion that anyone at a young age can do something for the country.
For Group 4, the question is, in political development, what happened in political system during Spanish colonial era? To answer that, the pre-Spanish Filipinos had no national government and were split into several kingdoms or barangays. Every kingdom has its own leader, governance, and set of laws. However, during Spanish authority, all of this changed. Spain established a colonial administration for the whole archipelago with the government based in Manila, the colonial capital. Spain developed a very centralized government with all laws, policies, rules, and regulations often coming from Manila.
Group 5's question: are those machineries that have bought here are still in good condition? Can you state some examples of those machineries? Threshers and plowers are the examples of machineries brought in the Philippines. At present, these are still widely used due to how fast and efficient these machines are compared to the farm animals being used for labor or manpower.
For Group 5 question, do you think that the corruption today is worse than the corruption that had in Rizal's time, and why? To answer that, the corruption happens on several levels in the Philippines. The only difference now is that it is our own nationals who are running our country. It is present at all levels of the governmental structure, and it ranges from small bribery to grand corruption, which impacts the government on large scale, and the sort corruption that is so pervasive that it is a part that daily structure of society, such as organized crime, which is known as a systematic corruption. Corruption persists even in the middle of the pandemic, as Rizal emphasized the significance of education, governance, observing the number of issues in our education system, such as the economic and class divisions in Philippine society, which has long been a significant problem in Philippine education, leads Rizal to critique our education system. For Group 6 question, if the rampant corruption of the government became one of the reasons why Rizal called for reform in government, why until now there is no effective solution to the government corruption? To answer that, although corruption varies from time to time, some of the major common driving reasons that causes it are as follows. Corruption cannot be judged conclusively since there is never a single phenomenon that is solely responsible for its occurrence and progression. Corruption is always the result of a number of interconnected variables that might differ greatly from one another. Political and economic environments, professional ethics and regulation, as well as simply ethnological elements such as conventions, habits, and traditions are among the most often stated factors that affect the emergence of corruption.
How was Jose Rizal affected by the events of the 19th century? Jose Rizal saw the evil acts in the 19th century by the friars. This inspired him in writing his famous novels El Filibusterismo and No Lime Tangere that showed the evil and unfair treatment of a friar. These novels expose the evil people in the 19th century that used their power to manipulate mainly the poor. From Group 7, how exactly did middle and upper class Filipinos increase their prosperity? Middle and upper class Filipinos were already doing better compared to the lower class. In the 19th century, the two classes have increased their prosperity due to the demand growth of the agricultural products. Middle and upper class were mainly Spaniards, friars, and hacienderos.
For Group 7 question, what was one big impact that constant changing of general governors had in our country? The answer is, during the Spanish occupation, the general governors were the most powerful political officials in the Philippines, and as the leader of the colonial administration, he was the King of Spain's representative. His power is dependent on the Spanish crown's confidence, and his executive power is total. He implemented all directions and orders and served as the head of the Spanish army to the Philippines during the Spanish colonial era, which had a significant influence on our country. Control and command the Spanish army in order to secure the colony. He was also the one who appointed and removed government officials, managed and controlled any government office that implemented and executed justice, and had pardoning authority, which aided in the suppression of corruption throughout the era.
Group 8's question, what was the most important event in Rizal's context of 19th century? There were major events that are considered remarkable and gave an impact in the country. But, as to what our topic could cover, the most important event is how the hacienderos and inquilinos have profited from their growing lands. Also, growth and development of nationalism is present as democracy was gradually established.
Group 8 question, what does the political system chart during the Spanish colonial era mean? To answer that, in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial era, the central government was represented by the political system chart. Spain built a centralized colonial administration comprised of a national government and local governments that managed provinces, cities, towns, and municipalities. The government is divided into two divisions, and there was no legislative branch under the Spanish occupation because all laws were issued by the royal decree. Group 9 question: what are the three causes that contributed to the emergence of Filipino nationalism in the 19th century? To answer that, many factors led to the rise of Filipino nationalism in the 19th century, including the desire to reclaim our lost independence, Spanish abuses or despotism, agrarian objections or the loss of Filipino lands, and the Spanish rulers' religious intolerance. There are numerous causes that led to the creation of Filipino nationalism in the Philippines, such as the opening of the Philippines to international or world trade, the rise of middle class, the infusion of liberal ideas from Europe, and the opening of the Suez Canal. For the second question of Group 9, what were the most significant changes in the 19th century? The answer is, the most significant changes in the 19th century was the feeling that drives the people together as a nation, love of country expressed in devotion to an advocacy of national interest and independence, while nationalism can foster national unity, progress, and independence.
Group 9's question: what role do those well-known families have in Philippine economics and politics? Well-known families' sons were sent to Europe to have higher education. And since education in the Philippines were still controlled by the clergies, knowledge would be biased. This caused the awareness and integrity of the now educated Filipinos to take stand for their rights. Why is Central Luzon, Batangas, parts of Bicol region, Negros, and Panay are mainly in agricultural products? These lands are vast and are rich in soil, which is why their main productions are usually agricultural products.
For Group 10 question, why is the country Spain is characterized by civil war? Spain emerged from the Civil War, a very different country than the early 1930s Republican experiment had predicted. The Spanish Civil War inflicted long-lasting wounds on a country tired, divided, and ravaged by years of civil warfare. In some aspects, Republican Spain was the outlier, with Franco Spain demonstrating continuity with the more traditional Spain.
How did economical development influence Rizal's growth as a nationalist? Economic development barely influenced Rizal as a nationalist, but it can be related onto how Spanish colonizers treated the low class despite of the prosperity in the 19th century. Slavery was still rampant and the abuse to power was still present. These abominable events were the inspiration of Rizal in his two novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, that later on encouraged the movement for independence.
For Group 11, compare and contrast the government of the Philippines during the Spanish period with our present government. The answer is, during the Spanish period, the Spanish Governor-General, who was selected by the Spanish Crown and in turn appointed local civil and military governors of provinces, was the leader of the Spanish military government in the Philippines. However, the Archbishop competed with him for political power. The Governor-General was in charge of both the Philippines colony and the Spanish crown at the same time. He does not, in a sense, care deeply for the Filipinos, but rather rules them, in theory, according to Spanish regulations. The Governor-General was primarily concerned with the relationship between the Spanish crown, as represented by the colony's administration, and the Spanish clergy in the Philippines. Philippines, on the other hand, is today an independent democracy with freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, so of course it's better than it was under the Spanish occupation.
Group 12's question: What were the three social structures during the Spain's ruling in the Philippines? The three social structures during the Spain's ruling in the Philippines are: first, highest class. The people that belong in this class include the Spaniards, Peninsulares, and the friars. They have the power and authority to rule over the Filipinos. They enjoy their positions and do what they want. Second, middle class. The people that belongs into this class includes the natives, mestizos, and the criollos. Lowest class. This class includes the Filipinos only.
For Group 12 question, during the Spain's ruling in the Philippines, Filipinos has to live in complete control and influence of the government, along with the injustices. How do you think this helped form the character of Jose Rizal? Jose Rizal was the most public example of the moderate resistance to Spanish colonial rule, advocating for political reforms in the Philippines under Spanish control. Jose Rizal was a figure of tremendous intellectual capacity as well as incredible creative skill, which I believe contributed shape the character of Jose Rizal. He excelled at everything he tried, including medicine, poetry, drawing, architecture, and sociology. For Group 13 question, during the Spanish colonial era, how did they deal the problems as the corruption of the government was unable to provide the basic needs of public works, schools, peace and order, and other prerequisites? Spain developed a government that was extremely centralized. The volatility of Spanish politics since King Ferdinand VII's difficult reign marked the beginning of political crisis in Spain. Corruption has long been a source of deterioration in public trust and in the government itself. The local government code does not encourage corruption but rather prevents it from occurring. If the legislature decides to examine and reread the code, they may discover what the previous Congress overlooked in enacting this statute. The government is contributing to its own demise by enacting rules that allow officials to pursue their own interests rather than those to the public.
Why is economic development important in Rizal context in 19th century? Economic development basically means economic growth. In the 19th century in the Philippines, the agricultural products such as rice, abaca, and sugar proliferated that helped the majority of the Filipinos when it comes to their growing lands. This gave the rightful Filipinos the money and influence to question the rights of the abominable friars. Philippine exports are mainly agricultural products in 19th century. Why farmers or people who work in agricultural industry up to these days are considered poor or less fortunate? The answer? It was the hacienderos who mainly profited during the economic development in the 19th century. Farmers, on the other hand, work for the hacienderos. Farmers have limited to non-access in agricultural credit and insurance. They are also severely affected on calamities and natural disasters. Agricultural products take time to grow and harvested to be sold. Researches for growth and developments are scanted. Government also allocates weak extension services. These factors mainly affect the farmers who are also selling products at the cheapest price.
For Group 14 question, what are the differences interdisciplinary from the 19th century and the present day? In political view, a conquered country such as the Philippines was developed, cultured, educated, and schooled in the science of self-government. However, during the 19th century, the seeming backwardness of the Spanish rulers' way of managing the nation, which resulted in the bondage and enslavement of the conquered, was severely attacked and criticized in publications. The Spanish government's demand forced labor and military duty on locals, as well as the government's abuse of power through exploitation by determining that any complaint against the authorities was illegal, making people uneducated, poor, and fanatical, therefore preventing the creation of a national sentiment. Today, however, Filipinos are directed by political philosophy. which has shown to be the study and application of reforms, the extension of human rights, the training for self-government, and the raising of a spirit of dissatisfaction over oppression, cruelty, inhumanity, sensitivity, and self-love expressed.